in the last lesson we looked at the concept of classical liberalism, and now in this lesson we're going to ask ourselves a very important debate, kind of topical question, which is whether or not democracy is compatible with the concept of liberalism. And this will touch on things that we looked at in the last lesson when we looked at John Stuart Mill and John Locke and their kind of classical understandings of liberalism, and we will expand upon that in this lesson here. We're going to basically look at the for and against for this argument, whether or not democracy is compatible with liberalism. So, as an introduction, Locke, if we talk about the classical liberal thinkers, people like Locke and Mill, for one, Locke argued that government should represent only property-owning men. Okay? And Mill also challenged Locke's view that representative government is even a good thing. He argued that it could lead to a tyranny of the majority. And these are both ideas that seem to be incompatible with democracy. Don't forget, democracy comes from the Greek word demokratia. So, demokratia, which effectively just means people power. People power. And so demos meaning people, and then kratia meaning power. So really, the concept of democracy, the idea of people power, has been challenged by Locke and Mill in these examples. Because if democracy is about giving power to the people, power in the political process to the people who are represented underneath, in that state, then Locke's view that it should be only property-owning men, well, that's something that challenges this democratic process, because for one, not all men are property-owning, and secondly, not all people are men. There's men and women. Okay. So, what is the debate to be had? Well, let's have a look on the one hand at whether or not liberalism is compatible with democracy. So, one would argue that democracy increases a person's individualism. Now, don't forget, individualism is a key tenet, a key core concept in the process of classical liberalism. Okay, democracy increases somebody's liberalism because it allows democracy increases people's individualism because it allows individuals to vote for who they want and make their own individual choice. Individual and rational choice. Okay, they're not told to vote by a party or a state. They are choosing to make whatever decision they want to make in the ballot at the ballot box. Okay, and so therefore you would argue that democracy promotes liberal tendencies. So you could argue that democracy promotes liberal ideas, which is very important. You could also switch it around and look from the other angle and talk about whether or not liberalism creates democratic ideas. So for one here, you have the concept of government by consent. This is a classical liberal Lockean idea. So this is a Lockean idea. And by Lockean we mean, from the works of John Locke. Government by consent, consenting to be represented by the state. Okay, and this is done through the democratic process of free and fair elections. So surely that if we want government by consent, okay, we must also have free and fair elections. Free and fair elections are a tendency of democracy, and government by consent is a core idea within liberalism. So you could argue that these two have to be compatible with each other because one brings about the other, and vice versa. Government by consent can be brought about through free and fair elections, and free and fair elections can bring about a situation, a scenario where we have government by consent. So, therefore, they are both compatible. Democracy can also limit state power, okay, by the people in charge, by the people in government, being accountable to the electorate. And that, again, this is something that is a democratic concept, and the democratic concept is limiting state power. The concept of limiting state power is one that is upheld by classical liberals. The concept of limited government. So all of these points here point to the fact that liberalism is compatible with the concept of democracy. These two theories go almost hand in hand in some cases, especially in cases of government by consent, and also when we're looking at the concept of limited government. So what are the arguments against it? Well, we've already talked about the argument that is presented by John Stuart Mill. He argued that a liberal representative system can lead to a tyranny of the majority. And so we discussed this in the last lesson, but let's imagine that we have a world or a state where the majority of the people decide that they want to go and elect a new modern United Kingdom National Socialist Party, a new Nazi party in the United Kingdom. Now, the majority of the people consent to this new party taking control and forming a government in the name of the crown. However, this is something that we would argue is it would cause a tyranny of the majority, literally a tyranny of the majority, because the minority opinion of people, maybe this new National Socialist Party is a white nationalist, so people who are a black minority ethnic people in the United Kingdom will struggle, and will have a harder time living in this country if we have a representative system where we have effectively a racist party that is in control. These are all concepts, that we would struggle to argue is democratic. The concept of racist policies and all these kinds of things. They're not very democratic. However, if we look at it in the lens that we just have, the idea of it being majority elected, then this fits within the core concepts of liberalism. This would still be conceptually still be a liberal kind of state. Now, you could obviously argue against this by talking about concepts of limited government. So limited government. And you can obviously make the argument in the scenario I gave was quite extreme. I gave quite an extreme example, and you could argue that things like natural rights, and the concept of constitutionalism. So natural rights and constitutionalism should protect the minority in extreme cases. But what about if we just have an example where the majority of people wanted to vote in a different tax law than the minority? Well, this is still technically a tyranny of the majority. However, we discussed this a lot more in the last lesson, whether or not this concept is something that is a convincing argument. Moving on now to what we looked at when we're talking about John Locke, people like John Locke argued that government should only represent the interests of property-owning men and be represented by property-owning men. Well, this is kind of problematic, seeing as John Locke is almost like the forefather of classical liberalism, and he didn't argue for liberalism to be a very democratic system, because by only representing a certain quite minority of interests, specifically property owning men, this will obviously reduce the franchise, the electorate, and also therefore decrease democracy. You could also make the argument that a representative liberal state is subject to the same problems as a representative democracy. So if we have a representative democracy, and now there's obviously a lot of problems, there can be problems with representative democracy. You could bring in things like representative versus direct democracy, for example. So representative versus direct democracy, the concept of a mandate, all these different problems. The concept of if you elect someone and they go off and do whatever things that you didn't want them to do, but the only real recourse within the law is to just vote them out in the next election. Well, the next election would be 5 years away, for example, at best. So you could argue that the concept of a representative liberal state is also subject to the same kind of problems that a representative democracy might have, and you looked at them when we discuss democracy, when we discuss participation and democracy as well. So overall, there's a back and forth to be had. If you want to ask my personal opinion, I would argue that liberalism can definitely be compatible with democracy. Especially when we start looking at modern liberalism, we start looking at more rawlsian ideas of the veil of ignorance and all these different kinds of concepts. Then we start to notice that a more reformed, a lot more rich and complex idea of liberalism than what was presented by the likes of Locke and Mill. So that's what we're going to do in the next lesson. We're going to look at modern liberalism. And then we're going to move into neo-liberalism and then try and unpack what neoliberalism means within political philosophy and really where it sits on any kind of political spectrum.